Good day, viewers. Welcome to another session of Code with Addo. Today we shall be looking at CSS. CSS for beginners. CSS. What is CSS? The full meaning of CSS is Cascading Style Sheets, and it is usually used in modern web development along markup language such as HTML to create responsive web pages and websites. I always say this that HTML is just like having a building without aesthetics, having your building without plastering, without paint, without beautification and all, right? But what CSS does is that CSS brings aesthetics, CSS brings responsiveness to our web pages, and it was firstly introduced in 1994 by Hakom William Lee while working with Tim Berners-Lee. Tim Berners-Lee was the inventor of World Wide Web. Initially, the challenges behind HTML were the structures and display. They were not looking that beautiful. Imagine a website. Look at this website that was initially created without CSS. By the way, if you are new to CSS, or rather, if you are new to HTML, because before you can use CSS, at least you must have a markup language, which is like HTML. If you are new with HTML and you need like crash course on HTML to get you started, check around on our channel or click the link below to have access to a crash course I did on HTML that would guide you through step by step to getting you started with CSS. Because in modern web development, you don't just use CSS, you use CSS along with a markup language such as HTML. So firstly, you need to understand what is HTML. You need to be able to render your HTML. You need to be able to do basic HTML. And it is this HTML we'll be using CSS to start. Imagine having this HTML we did in one of our courses. Look at the HTML. A step further by introducing CSS in this particular course and seeing the difference and see how it will transform into a more beautiful and responsive website. That is CSS for you. Cascading Style Sheets. Please, before I go on, I want to plead with you to like this video, subscribe to our channel and keep your notification bell on to keep in touch with us whenever new updates are being done. And in the course of this training, if you have any question, you can drop it on the comment section, and kindly check our description for our Discord link. You could subscribe and keep in touch and be part of our Discord community, so you are being carried along in other activities. Like I said, CSS, it's not a programming language. It is a style sheet language. It is used to add beauty. It is used to add responsiveness to web pages. And in a jiffy, we shall be hitting the editor and have a practical coding and implementing all we are talking about, right? Stay with us and let's go through this together. Let's do this together. Like I said, if you have questions, please drop it on the comment section and I'll always do well to answer you. If you want to reach out one-on-one, you can reach me on codeWithAddo@gmail.com. Thank you and God bless you. Alright, based on our UI design, the first thing I would want us to do is removing the elements that are not needed. So we'll remove the tables, this list and this table. Then we'll leave the logo, the menu, the H1 welcome to class, the registration form with the logo on it, right? And the footer and maybe this little text under. So let's get started. We'll come to the editor. These are let's remove the div with the listings and the table. So we'll remove this. And we save. Alright. So before we do anything, we want to rearrange this using our CSS to align with what we have on our plan. Before we do this, let me explain something briefly. We'll continue on this, but let me explain something briefly. In the body tag, Let me comment some things here. Let me comment from the header to the footer. You already know what comment is. In HTML, comment is you just making sure whatever you have does not render, but you are not deleting it. It's there, and this is a long comment. So once I save, my codes are there, but nothing will be displayed. Yes, nothing will be displayed because I've commented off everything. I just want to explain something. So now in the body, let's look at a simple div. We already know what a div is. A div is a division. I just want to give some basic introductory stuff to this thing before we really go on into the main thing, using it to explain. Let's have h1 here. Let's call this testing something. Let's call this testing something. Refresh testing something. So now let's start. We want to start by explaining CSS, how to apply your CSS to your HTML, that's to your markup language. And I just wanted to, before we go into the main thing we have, like working to achieve this particular design, this UI design, just wanted to firstly use this h1 and a div to explain something very briefly, so that once we start working towards the design, it will be easier for us to follow and makes it very easy, right? So now the first thing we're going to do is this. How do you style your markup language? There are different ways you can style it. There are different methods of CSS, and the main three methods we shall be looking at here. It's number one, inline CSS. Inline CSS. What is inline CSS? Inline CSS means you apply your CSS directly to the element, which in this case, let's say we are looking at tag. Tag is h1 tag is an element, even this div is an element. So how do you style them? Number one is using the inline CSS. So inline means you apply the style directly within the opening tag. So for the inline, you come to the opening tag, you give a space, and you type style. Remember, CSS is a style sheets language. You type style, double quotes, then you could give it color. You give it red and save. Once you refresh, the text has become, this is big enough, has become red, right? Each one has a default font, but if you want to customize the font again, you could come and say font size. If you give it 5 pixels, what happens? It becomes very small. You can see it becomes very small. Now let's give it times 10 of that and see how it's been controlled. Let's say 50 pixels, and this will even be bigger than the normal default. You can see testing something, you see how big it is. So this is way controlling and styling an element using the inline CSS. Although this inline CSS is not what I will recommend, it's not the standard, right? It's not the standard, but because this is CSS for beginners, I just wanted to firstly introduce something. Even the main thing we want to work on, I've commented it out. We'll get to that shortly. Just wanting to explain how these things work. One of the disadvantages of this h1 is if you should have multiple h1, we should have multiple h1. Hello, let's call this hello h1. Once you have this, you cannot apply a single style to them. That means if you have tens of them, you have to be going to different h1 to add the inline style. This is just for quick. Maybe you have to style something quickly without, maybe it's just a one of something, and it's just like one of the most basic way of styling in CSS. That is number one. The second one we want to talk about is the internal CSS. Is the internal CSS. That one in the head, you add the style tag to it. then as a matter of fact, you can call any of the elements using type selector. Type selector, it's you accessing the tag name directly. We'll get to that when we talk about selectors. We'll get to that, but let's get to the external CSS. Then we talk about selector mainly. So let's say here, but before then, I want to refresh so we get back to the default. So we see the changes that apply when we make. So here, when you come and you use your type selector, that is like tag name, and you say color, you say blue. Now, this works, change to blue, right? So what this means is that since you've used the type selector here, once you have another H1, like we're trying to do, we'll say hello H1 like we did. Now, once you refresh, one advantage of using this internal CSS is it applies to all H1. At times, you might not really want to apply to many H1. There are different ways of going around it. But all we're just trying to learn here is the different types of CSS that you apply to your markup language. So here you could come again and let's give it the same font size. Let's head on. There are default, extra large, whatever, but let's just manually enter the same 50 pixels and see the application. So you can see it applies and works. So this second method is what we call the internal CSS. And I still don't recommend this, though it's still a little bit standard than the inline CSS, but it's not the best. It's not the standard. And what we'll be looking at mainly now, where we'll spend most of the time and most of the things we'll be doing here, is the external CSS. How does the external CSS work? The external CSS works in such a way that still within the head tag, you would link your external sheet. You will link a CSS file to an external sheet, right? In the head tag, you will link a file. You create a new CSS file, and this CSS file must be in the same folder or directory, not exactly the same level anyway, but the folder, this is the folder we are using for our work. We have the index, we have the logo. So the CSS would definitely be in this folder. It could be inside another folder, maybe CSS folder that you reference, it doesn't matter, but everything at least must be inside this HTML folder. That is the most important thing. So what we want to do here is, first of all, let's link we'll create this file, but we'll link. So you could do it anyway. You could create first before linking, or you link and then create the file. But let's link. So once we come here, we do less than link rel equals to double quote. This rel means relationship. So it's telling you the kind of file you are linking to, and in this case is a style sheet, right? href is link. This href is a link. It's a link to the name of the file that you are linking to, and in that case, let's say we call the CSS, let's call it styles. So it must have the .css extension, is a must since it's a CSS file, just the way we have .css. So once we save, right? Once we save and we've saved this, so this styles.css, we must create it. So let's do Control N, even without writing anything. Let's save this and call it styles.css. Styles.css. All right, good. Now we have our styles.css. Now, how do we now reference the element in the HTML now that we've linked using link relate equals to style sheet, then href equals to styles.css? You see, it's also a self-closing tag. We don't have to have a closing tag for it. Most of our tags in the head are self-closing. We don't have to add closing tag, but when we did style, we needed to close down, and so please take note. So now this would take us to the first thing called selectors. There are different selectors, but mainly what I want to look at here, we'll be looking at the most basic selectors, right? maybe we look at type selectors, that is using the tag name like we did when we did the internal CSS. So we could use what we call the class selector, using the point dot period dot something is for the class. Then we could also use the ID, the ID selector using hashtag. But for the purpose of layout, there are places you mainly use your ID. I would dedicate a course specially on difference between class and ID, and how when to use what and how to use what, right? But for the purpose of layout, when dealing with layout, like we'll be doing designs and more of it, we'll be using class. ID are used mainly maybe when you have an element, you want to call the element, you want to update the element, maybe using in DOM or something, or you have like a link you want to navigate to within a page, you want to navigate to a particular section, that you cannot use class, you must just definitely use ID. But for the sake of layout, for the purpose of layout and what we have in this course, CSS for beginners, let's dedicate it, let's leave it up to class. Okay, yes. But like I said, firstly, the first one, let's look at it. It's type selector, like you could just call your H1, add your color braces to it, like we've been doing. Give it a color, right? Once you give it a color, let's say we want red. This is using hexadecimal codes. Hexadecimal code just gives you like many opportunities to have different shade. You could have red, but different shade of red. But for now, you could use it the way you type it, red directly blue. There's no problem. Over time, when you need to use the hexadecimal colors, you will know how to use it and when to use it. So now let's say font size. We're just trying to look at it on the external CSS. Here we've added the font size to it. So once we refresh, you see now we are controlling our HTML using an external file, this styles.css. Okay, so that is number one. Number two, let's say we are looking at ID. Let's look at ID. Let's give this particular H1. Remember when we call using the type selector, that means you can call many multiple H1. Okay, now let's say ID. What ID means is that here inside this place we add an ID to it, and let's say we give this bigger heading. Let's call it bigger heading. Okay, let's save. So once we come to the style, what we're going to do is this H1, we're no longer going to use H1 since we've added an ID to it. Like the work of an ID is to target individual elements and give them that styles using their ID. So what we have here, we have bigger heading. So what we'll do here, we'll add the hashtag bigger heading. Once we save, right, let's see what happens now. Remember, before I even refresh, unlike the first one, that when we use the type elements using the tag name, you see all the tag name with H1 were affected and the CSS applies to everything. But now that we've added an ID to one, and we reference based on that ID bigger heading, and we've changed it. And remember, to use the ID selector, you use hashtag. So once we come here and refresh, what happens? You see that it now only applies to that particular one with the ID, right? It now applies only to the one with the ID. So if you should come, maybe this it's like, let's change this to blue. Once we come and refresh, you see it's now blue, and even the bigger text only applies to that. So that is the second one. using the ID selector. But like I said, for the purpose of this class, what we shall be using mainly is class. What we shall be using mainly is class. So instead of ID here, I could change this to class. That means all H1. Maybe I want to be using bigger heading. I want to be using bigger heading for all the H1, right? So what it means is this: you can now have multiple pages and say, okay, this particular bigger heading, I want to maintain this big font of 50 pixels. This 50 pixels, I want to apply it to any bigger heading. So you can define this, right? Add this class anywhere you need to use bigger heading. All you just need to do is to pass this class to it. Okay. Let's say we have another H1 here. We have another H1. It might not even be H1. It could be any other tag actually. Let's say we have hello. Let's say we have this long hello, and we have this style. So what you can do is that here, once you pass any class, you pass this class bigger heading, it would always apply that would always apply to it. You see, it doesn't apply. Why did it not apply? Because when we come for class, we no longer use hashtag, but we use this period, this dot point, this dot full stop. So once we add this now, because it's a class, we change it from hashtag. Hashtag was for ID, but this full stop, it's for class. So once we have this and we come and refresh, it will apply to only those particular elements that we added. Okay, you can see something, but the default H1 still counts. That is why when you come and change this to H1, that boldness, as in that strong, it being like strong and bold, it will also apply it to the H1. Okay, so please take note of that. It inherits and it works. You can see the difference, but that depending on the tag, but the property you assign, which is the color, which is the font size, will also apply directly. If you add every other thing, it would. So this is the first explanation I'm making, and what I've done is we've seen the different CSS. We've learned about the inline CSS. We've learned about the inline CSS where you style directly within the tag. We've learned about the internal CSS where you put it within your head tag using the style tags. Then we have the external CSS, which is the main thing, like I said, which you create a dedicated external CSS file and you link it within the head tag using the link style sheet href, the name of the CSS file. And also we've looked at selectors. There are different types of selectors, but we've just looked at the basic three. Yes, the number one, we talked about the type selector where you have to call directly using the tag name. Then we talked about the ID selector where you apply your ID within the element and you call it using hashtag. Then lastly, the main thing we'll be looking at, like I said, is the class selector where you apply your class and you define the class within the CSS. There are other different types of selectors where you could call a div, like if you should come and say div, you say div and maybe you give it a p. This will apply directly to all the paragraph tag within a particular div. Let's say in this our div we have okay, look at something here. Let me change this to paragraph so you see the difference how it applies. Let's change this, but inside this div now we have another paragraph. Hello, this is a paragraph. This is the paragraph within a div. Okay, now if we should come and style this and we say color, we already have blue here. Then maybe let's give this one yellow. Let's give it yellow, ff00. Okay, let's give this yellow. Now once we come and refresh, this yellow will only apply to this. Let's give it red so that it's clear. It like so it can be visible. You can see this applies just to this paragraph. But meanwhile, we have another paragraph here. As we have another paragraph tag p hello, this long hello that has this class. It doesn't apply to it. Even if this class wasn't there, it will still not apply to it because the method we've used to reference to select it now, it's like only, you can see it only applies to this because we call the div and we give it that p, so it will apply only to the paragraph within. And like I said, there are different selectors here. If we add a font size, let's say we add a font size of 30 pixels. Like I said, it only applies to all the paragraph within that div. So please take note of that, take note of that. And let's continue. Now, permit me, having understood this, let me remove this because the purpose of what we are doing here is just, we've not even gone to the main thing. I'm just using this to explain briefly. So now we have this div, we have this div, now we have this div. Do we maintain this paragraph in the div or let's remove it? When we have to, we'll come to it. But let's look at this div itself. Div, like I said, is a division, like it's showing you like the boundary where you should have something. And remember when we talk about div, the outward div is the parent. We've talked about parent and child or children element. The most outward div or element is the parent, while the one inside, if it is one, is a child. But if there are more than one, they are children. In this particular case, this div, when we have the div, this is the parent, and this paragraph tag is a child of this particular div. Let's say we have more than one. Let's say we have h1 in here. Let's say we have another h1 in here. We call maybe heading or anything. So what we'll say is that this div has two children, the paragraph and the h1 tag. Okay. So, but let's not get carried away with that. Just take note of parent and children and know how it works. And remember what I talk about bubbling. Bubbling, it's the way information are being the way information flow with respect to the DOM document object model, whereby when there is an action on one, let's say when there is a click on a particular element, that element fills it and it moves up to its parent, with grandparent, great grandparent, and so have you. That is what we call bubbling. That is the effect of any action taken on an element, how it moves from that element to its parent, its grandparent, and what have you. But for the sake of this, let's come to this our div. Let's give it a class. Let's call this test div. Let's call this test div. And since we are using our class, let me remove everything here. So we can come now and say inside this we use our dot test div, right? We have this our test div and we put our curly braces. Now what do? We could, let's give this a width. Let's say we have a width of 400, or let me call it 500 pixels. Then we have a height. Let's give it a height of then 500 pixels. Then let's give it a background color. Let's give it a background color. Let's say blue. So once you save and you refresh, we have a div, and this is a div. It's like a box, giving us a box. We've just given some definition. Div means division. We've set up a division on this platform that this is this, okay? And here, maybe inside this our div, let's now have the same paragraph tag. Let's have the same paragraph tag. Let's say this is a paragraph. This is a paragraph. Okay. Once we say, by default, it will be what? It will be black, yeah, and small. But let's just use the type selector without wasting our time. Let's use the type selector and call the tag name directly. Let's call this, if we give it a color and we say white in order to make it clearer, we could come here and refresh. You see it's white inside the div. we could come now and say, let's increase the font size. At least we've been working on this. Well, let's say we are given it 20 pixels. Let's save and refresh. So we have it, it's big. You can see it so clearly inside it. Okay, let me make it 50. So it's very big at least and very clear. So once I refresh, you can see we have this inside the paragraph. Okay, now even within your div, inside your div, you can have another div. You can have as many divs inside, but just take note that the main one, the test div, is the parent, while the paragraph and any other thing inside this are called what? The children div. So now let's give this maybe a class and call this maybe child one, or we can call it anything. Okay, let me just call the child div. Let me just call it child div. Let me call it child div, which could be child div one, child div 2. That is if you have more than one, but since we are using class again, what do we use? Dot. So we could call this our child div, right? Let's apply a smaller stuff to it. Now let's say maybe width, let's give it a 200 pixels. Then let's give it a height of 200 pixels. Can be anything. Then let's give it a different background color to see the difference. Let's give this one red. So since this is a child, once you come, what do you expect? You see another box inside of this. Yes, that is how it works. Okay, this is another box inside of this. But now when it comes to CSS, there's one thing I would love to introduce here. What I would love to introduce here, it's how to make this responsive, how to move all this around. There are different ways you could do it. If you want to do your based on our layout, these are the ways we are going to set up our layout using divs and children divs. But how do we control in such a way that it's standard, it meets the minimum international requirement standard, and that is the essence of what we are doing. What we've been doing so far is just introducing some basic thing in CSS, but now I want to take it a little bit, want to take it a step forward, meeting up minimum standard based on minimum requirement internationally. So what do we want to do now? Number one, we want to look at how this can be responsive and how we can control things around it to achieve what we want with respect to this our plan. We've not yet gone back to the plan, but once you understand what I'm doing here by me taking time to explain this element briefly, once we now hit the plan, in fact, within just 2-3 minutes, we are done with that. So I'm only taking my time for you to understand so that once we now uncomment the main work, doing our work to meet that plan, you understand it perfectly. And one of the things I would want to bring me here to explain, it's what I call flex. We've already known what divs are. So now we want to look at flex. What is a flex? Flex is defined as one-dimensional layout model that stack things either horizontally or vertically. That is either in rows or in column. Rows means horizontal, while vertical means column, right? In science generally, there's what we call the x and y axis. The x axis is the main axis, is the default axis, while the y axis is the vertical axis. And one thing I want you to take note here is this: flex by default, it's always in the row. That is flex direction by default, it's row. So based on what you want, you can now control how it behaves in certain, with respect to the screen and with respect to many other stuff. Okay, so now let's get to this. But now talking about screen and other stuff, the first thing I want to talk about here in this here, it's viewpoint height, the viewpoint height, VH. But before then, let's look at this. Like I said, in our HTML, what there are different tags, right? We use the semantic tags in other places, but what handles what is being displayed on the screen are everything within the body tag, and the body tag is like the main grandparent or the main parent of every other thing inside this HTML. So the first thing we are going to do here, for the sake of flex, explaining Flex, what I would do is this. Let's remove the text. Let's remove the text. Let's remove the text. Or let's leave it. Let's leave it. But the main thing I want to do is that the body can be anywhere, but let's have it first since it's the main thing. Okay, that is the body tag, and I'm going to call it using type selector. So I will say body, and I will give it a height. When I give it a height, I will give it 100 VH. What this means is this 100 VH is that by default use the full screen of any device that you are using. Okay, that don't use the full screen. And another thing I would want to introduce at this point, like when I refresh, look at something to the right, you will see like a long this scroll bar. That is one of the effects of the 100%. It's like using it 100%. This has given us the complete viewpoint of this our browser. Okay, but once things go longer than it, it will by default flow, and the scroll bar would increase. That is a default something. Now we're in CSS. We're trying to have our arrangement and have our standard in such a way that it's responsive and make it standard. And one last thing I want to add here before we go on, or I want to point to, is this meta viewport content. Device width equals to device width, initial scale 100%. I mentioned it while doing I mentioned it in our HTML class that this is very key. It is very, very important because this is telling you that any screen you are using, any device you are using, that it should be responsive, it should work with it, and it should be dynamic with it, such that things work perfectly with respect to responsiveness. What I mean responsiveness is when you view the way your web pages displays, the way they are being rendered when viewed across different screens. When you view it on larger screens such as desktop, the way it appears is different from the way it appears when you view it on tabs and smaller screens such as mobile devices. And having gotten here, one thing I would also want to introduce is how to view stuff on mobile. Okay, let me duplicate this same thing on another tab so we see the difference. So once you refresh here, you see one thing is this on the browser. Once you restore, right, this would give you like a glimpse of how it will appear on a mobile device. But to do it more standardly, you can right click and use the dev tools. Once you right click, click on inspect, come to this toggle device toolbar. Once you toggle it, what happens here? You have different devices. You can even change it to iPhone XR and wherever. This is how it will appear in your different device using iPhone 12 Pro Max as example. Now look at something. Let's have another let's just introduce before I even start with the flex directly. Within this div, we have, let's call this child div 1. This is child div 1. Okay, so that means we'll come here and change it to child div 1. Now let's have child div 2. So I can copy this and paste it. I can copy this and paste and have child div 2. Have child div 2 and save. So here I can come and duplicate this child div 2, div 1, and just name it child div 2. Maybe I could give this yellow. Now let me give this yellow. Let me give this yellow. Okay. So now once we refresh this, now we have this. Good. Okay, sorry, we've not changed this to child div 2. So we have this as child div 2. Okay. So once you come and refresh, look at what happens, right? You see this is already even flowing out of why, because of this paragraph. But let's maintain this. Okay, let me increase the height or reduce the font of this paragraph. I just want us to see the effect of everything happening. So let's say this, I take this back to 20, right? And I come, I refresh. Good. We have this. Then on our mobile view, we have it this way. Okay, everything is still going on fine now. But look at something. We want to now have a situation. You see that what div does is that div, like I said, by default one div comes on top of another. Okay, that is a div for you. But now we want to take it a step further. We no longer want to just work with div, but we want to convert these divs to flex. We want to convert them to flex, and I already explained what a flex is. A flex is a one-dimensional layout model that stacks either in row or in column. It can choose one way, either start in row, that is the main axis, or in column. And the purpose of using flex is for your layout, so you can have a layout and control the children the child or children in that flex to achieve the main purpose you want. You could say, okay, if it's on a desktop, let it be in row, right? But if it's on a mobile device, let it be in column, because when you have website, the way it displays on desktop is different from the way it displays on mobile devices such as phone. Desktop is wide. If you look at the way we have our logo to the left, the menu to the right, but on phone you can see that the logo comes up and every other thing comes down. So that is the way you control. You have 100% power and control. And the flex has many properties such as justify content, different things that are applied to flex. And flex is one of the most important feature in CSS, and that is what we want to start looking at now. Let's just dive in briefly. Like I said, if you have questions, you can always drop on the comment section. So now let's start with this parent div to explain something. So once I come here, the first thing I'm going to do is that this test div, which it's like the parent div, or let me now call it parent div. Let's call it parent div. Let's change it to parent div. So that means once we change to parent div, where we have this our test div, we'll have to also rename it to what? Parent div. Okay, so the first thing we are doing here is this. Let me remove everything. I will not want to use width, I will not want to use height. I will still use them, but there's a way we want to control them this time around, right? Let me remove it. So the first thing I want to do here is to make this parent div a flex. The first thing I will say display. Once I say display, I will say flex. Okay, once it's flex and I refresh, firstly look at what happened. Let me give it the same background color. Let me give it the same background color. Let me give it the same background color of blue, so you can see that it's still on it blue. Once we save and refresh, what did you observe? You observe something, right? That the first thing that happened, that before now, look at something, before we made this thing flex, before we made it flex, look at what happened. It was this. But when we added flex, let me just even add flex and leave the width so that you see something. Display. When I say flex, what happens? Things that were on vertical, that the things that were column, automatically, let me refresh now. Look at this red was on top of this yellow before, but once I refresh, what happens? It becomes horizontal, it becomes row. That is why we say by default flex direction are row. This is what it means, right? And this is just then limited because I added this width. So if I should remove this width, you will see that by default, again, without giving it any width, by default, what happens? It floats along, and those are the behavior of flex. And don't worry, with time you're going to get used to it. Okay, it flows out horizontally and filled up that distance. Okay, so now if, like I said, this thing by default there's what we call flex direction. By default it is row. So once I add row, it's still the same effect. This is mainly for like when you come here and you refresh, you see even on mobile this thing has become row, right? But if you should come and now say you want to control it, and you see the reason for the control later, and when you say column, this it's something that will now change everything back to column. And take note, it is applying to the children. Whatever you apply to the parents, which is the parent div, the effect is on the children. It controls the children. And one of the reasons, let me say it again, there's a different course I have for HTML and CSS. You could check that out, but this one we're trying to dedicate this to beginners, CSS for beginners. And if there's anything here that is still like looking so strange and difficult, probably it's your first time, and you could always reach out one-on-one at codewithaddo@gmail.com, or you drop your questions on the comment section. We're always here and happy to help. But let's pick it up. Remember that our main design is still there. We've not touched it. I'm just trying to use this to explain what we are doing. So at this point, let me remove the text here because we really don't need the text for now, so that it doesn't cause any confusion. Let's know that we are dealing with layout, directly layout, whatever we now have when we need any other thing. So for here, I would want to remove this. Remember, when you have your website, when you have your web app, higher percentage, over 80% of people that view your stuff do that on their mobile devices, maybe using their phone or tab. So that is the reason why when building you have to be intentional, and as a matter of fact we give priority to mobile devices first. So we say when we design, we are targeting mobile devices, but there will not be a query, there will not be a snippet that will not say, however, if the device used in viewing these web pages, it's not a mobile device. If the width is higher than the default of mobile devices or tabs, let's say for example 768 pz, if minimum is 768 pz, if it is at least 768 pixels and above, you can now change the flex direction to row, but by default let it be in column. And what we'll be doing going forward, by default it will be in column. Okay, so now let's go. So what we want to look at again now, it's something called, look at something here. We have this now in column. We say let's have it in column, which is the standard for mobile devices. It's in column. When you come here, you have it in column, right? But we want this thing that whenever it's on mobile device, if it's on mobile, if it's on desktop or wider screen, it should not arrange this way. It will not make sense. This since there are this horizontally, so that's how we control that, and that is what we use. We call media query. So media query is just like you controlling that, telling your web app, web pages, website that check the device being used in viewing this content. If it is a mobile device, if the screen are smaller, if it is a phone or tab with smaller screen, by default let it remain column. That is a standard. Mobile first. We give priority to mobile and smaller screen because that is what most people, higher and larger percentage of people use in viewing website, viewing web pages. Is people like the tech people most time, or for personal or for some specific purpose use laptop and whatever, but most people generally use their mobile device. But now we want to like add a command that anyway, if it is a larger screen, right, if it's a larger screen, then make it row. This flex direction, make it row and no longer column. So what we'll do is that we'll say add media. This is just a snippet. We'll say add media. We'll now say minimum width. Minimum width. Let's say if it is 768 pixels. That if it is 768 pixels and above, that means it's no longer a mobile device. This could be like a bigger screen, given attention, given with respect to what we've defined here. So we could now say call that parent div that if it is by default, make it a column. By default it is a row, but we manually change it to column because we are giving priority to mobile first view, to smaller screen. But we'll now say, however, if the minimum width is 768 pixels, that is, if it is at least 768 pixels and above, it is no longer a smaller screen. So at this point, call the same flex you want to handle. You could say this now, then flex direction. You now say flex direction should be row, okay. So what we've done now is that when we come and refresh, because this it's a wider screen, once you refresh you will have this in row. Can you see it? But once you come to the mobile view and refresh, it remains in column. Please take note of this. This is like one of the basic things that once you understand this, you are already, in fact, more than halfway, more than a default, more than like you are on the right track. Media query is what we use to control the display, the rendering of our web pages with respect to the kind of screen. Okay, that is number one. Remember I said something that when dealing with flex, there is the parent, then we have the parent, then we have the child and children. Okay, but now whatever property you apply to the parent, it applies directly to the children. Remember I talked about bubbling. That is one of the effects of bubbling. What happens to the parent? Like it is what happens to the parent that controls what happens to the children. So once you have the parent div, once you apply what you apply to the parent div applies to the child or children if it is more than one, and that is what we've just practically illustrated. We have the parent div, and what we said is that we give it a display, flex direction, row and column that controls it. Okay, take note of that. Then another important thing I also want to introduce at this point is how to arrange the child or children elements within a flex. Yes, how to arrange it. And the first thing we want to look at is, let me, for the purpose of this explanation, let me limit this, or let me just comment out one of the children div. Let's come to the index to the HTML file. This child, this child div 2, let me comment it. You already now know what comment is. We are not removing it, but it remains there. Okay, so now we have this. So once we refresh, we only have one child element within this parent div, which is this red div. So what I'm going to do right now is, let's see what happened when we come. Let's introduce some other key features within Flex. So when I come to this parent div and I said, if you want to control how your child or children within a Flex moves now to the center, let's start with that. Let's look at the center. Want to move to center? There are two ways to control. You can control either on the horizontal axis or on the vertical axis. Okay, what I mean on the horizontal axis is that once you move to center, there are two ways. If you move this, it will come to the center horizontally, and there's another way you can bring it to the center vertically, so that it's exactly at the center. So first thing, and I remember I say, once you want to control the child or children within a div, within a flex, what you do is that you apply the features, you apply those features to the parent itself. So when I come to this parent div, there's something we call justify content. When you say center, justify content means it moves the child or children within this flex to the center, but horizontally. What do I mean? Horizontally. Justify content works horizontally. It moves stuff to the center horizontally. It moves stuff to the center horizontally. So once I come and I refresh here, what happens? These things move to the center horizontally. To the center horizontal. If you want it to move vertically, there's what we call align items. You come, you add your align items. Once you add align items center, it will move it to the vertical. That means it's moving both vertical. The first one moves horizontal, but this one brings it vertically. You can see. That means um if we had commented, let's say now we comment this. You already know what comment is, how to comment in HTML. But for CSS, you use this forward slash asterisk, then you add the asterisk forward slash in front of it. This is a single line comment. Okay, now we've removed the justify content, the one that moves it to the center horizontally. We've removed it. So what we have now is only the vertical one. You can see. Okay, and take note, to have a long comment, all you just need to do is to end it wherever you want it to end. Okay, so I hope we now understand justify content and align items. Justify content moves the child or children to the center horizontally, while the other moves vertically, and it applies even if it is more than a child. So if we should uncomment this here and have our child div 2, you see that what applies to one applies to all, so it controls everything here. Okay, so even if we had added our text to it, the same thing applies. Please take note of this. Take note of this. Okay, now let's take this a step further by controlling the width and height, but let's give priority to width for now. Using flex, I might not want to call it width, I might want to call it distribution, and that is how the widths are being distributed among the children of a flex, so now the first thing I want to do is I want to remove the width here within this child div 1. I remove this width, then I also remove this width too here, also remove this width. So once you refresh, what happens It's like it's gone, right? But it's not. So what we want to do is this: we want to distribute. There's a way of distributing width using flex. So when I come here and I say flex, and I say flex 1, okay? When I say flex 1 and I come here and I say flex 1, what I've done is this. You remember this parent div has two children. That is child div 1 and child div 2. So what I'm saying is that the total width of this parent div distribute it equally. 1 means 50-50%. Yes, it is this ratio we use to control it. Yes, it means when I come here and I refresh, I don't expect to see anything, okay, other than having this thing distributed equally 50-50. You can see it, but the height now is being controlled by the children's height. So once we have our content in here, that is what we control the height. But please take note, since I plan having content inside this div1, which we take text or take other content, so I would make the display, rather, sorry, I would also want the display to be flex. So this child div1, I will make it flex. Then even this, I would make the display flex as well. Take note of that, please. Take note of that. So we have this now, okay, and it is also responsive. So now before we move on before we move on to our main design, let's still look at one thing here. Let's look at something here, right? What we are going to do here is this: we want to come to this children. Now we want to remove the width here. We want to remove the width here and the height. Okay? We want to remove the width and the height. Let's remove the width here and the height. Let's remove the width here and the height. Now, once we save, what happens? Let me refresh. It's like everything is gone. Perfect. Now, these are the default behaviors of Flex, but I want to introduce something. Now, the parent div, the height remains 500, okay? So what we have for the children now by default are taking the height of the parent div, which is 500 pixels. But then the width, now we want to control it using Flex. And in this case, we'll not be using Flex, we'll be using like ratio or distribution, okay? So once we come here, take note of this. If I should say Flex 1, right, this flex actually means this word flex combines like 3 properties, that is flex grow, flex shrink, and base. But please don't worry about that. For the sake of this course, don't worry about that. But for now, let's just use flex directly. When we say flex 1 and we say flex 1, what it means is this: we are saying that the default width of this parent div, divide it into equal part 1:1. That means take up the full width and the height, but give it equal division. Let me and we have this now, okay? So hopefully you now understand the basic techniques, you now understand the basic principles with respect to div, flex, and how to control some of these basic things.